It started as just another shift. Plates clattered, coffee poured, and the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air. Amy had worked at this diner for years, moving between tables with a practiced smile. She knew most of the regulars by name, their usual orders memorized like second nature. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was home. Or at least it used to be. That morning, a man walked in, dust on his boots, tired eyes, and a quiet, polite demeanor. A contractor, Amy guessed. He looked like he had been working since dawn. When he sat down at one of her tables, she greeted him with the same warmth she gave every customer. "What can I get you?" she asked. "Just a coffee, please," he replied, glancing at the menu. He looked hesitant, like he was debating whether he could afford more. Amy had seen this before. Hard-working folks, stretched thin. She didn't think twice before slipping him a plate of eggs and toast on the house. Just a small kindness. One meal. She figured no one would notice. But someone did. From across the room, her boss, Rick, sat in his usual spot near the register, watching everything. He had owned the diner for years, and Amy had long since learned to stay out of his way. He had a temper, short and mean. The kind of man who measured worth in dollars and control. The moment Amy handed over that plate, she knew she had made a mistake. Not because she regretted it, but because of the look on Rick's face. His expression hardened, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. When the man finished his meal, he left a tip, more than she expected. He thanked her, his gratitude quiet but sincere, and walked out. Rick didn't wait. The second the door swung shut, he called Amy to the back. She barely had time to take off her apron before the words hit her like a slap. "You're done. Get out." For a second, she thought he was joking. Fired. Over a plate of eggs. She argued, but it didn't matter. Rick wasn't just angry, he was furious. He spat out words about stealing, about how she gave away his money. But Amy knew what this was really about. If it had been any other customer, maybe he would have let it slide. But not this man. Amy felt the heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks as she grabbed her things and walked out the back door, the smell of grease and coffee clinging to her clothes. Years of loyalty gone in an instant. She should have been devastated. Instead, she was angry. Rick thought he had the power. He thought firing her was the end of it. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Amy had something he didn't. A way to take everything from him. And by the time she was done, Rick would regret the day he ever crossed her. Amy walked home that night with her mind racing, hands clenched into fists in her pockets. The cool air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Every step she took was filled with anger, frustration, and something else, determination. Rick had tossed her aside like she was nothing, like all the years she had given to that place didn't matter. He fired her in front of everyone, humiliated her over a single act of kindness. But Amy wasn't the type to roll over and accept defeat. By the time she reached her tiny apartment, she had already started piecing things together in her head. There had to be a way to make Rick pay for what he did. Not just for her, but for all the times he had treated people like garbage and gotten away with it. She tossed her bag onto the couch and let out a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. Rick was a man who believed he was untouchable. He controlled that diner like a king on his throne, making up rules as he went, taking advantage of people who needed a paycheck too badly to stand up to him. Amy had seen it happen more times than she could count. The way he underpaid the cooks, how he'd fire waitresses the second they started pushing back. The way he treated the dishwasher, a young single mom, like she was disposable. And now her. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a familiar name, Jake. Jake had been a cook at the diner before Rick forced him out. One of the best workers there, but Rick found a way to push him to the edge, cutting his hours until he had no choice but to leave. Amy hadn't talked to him in a while, but if anyone would understand what she was feeling, it was him. She hit the call button. "Hello." Jake's voice was groggy, like she had woken him up. "Hey, it's me," she said. "I got fired." There was a pause. "What? Why?" She exhaled sharply. "For giving a customer a free meal." "A black contractor." Another pause. This time, she could hear Jake breathe in like he was holding back words. "Rick, who else?" Jake let out a low curse. "That man is a piece of work." "I'm done letting him get away with it," Amy said, her voice firm. "I don't know how yet, but I need to hit him where it hurts." A silence stretched between them before Jake spoke again, his voice lower this time. "I might have something." Amy's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" You ever wonder why Rick never got shut down? The place barely scrapes by, but somehow he always manages to keep the doors open. Amy frowned, thinking back. The diner wasn't exactly thriving, but Rick had a way of making things work. Too well, now that she thought about it. "You know something." "I know enough to make him sweat," Jake said. "But if we do this, we have to be smart about it." Amy didn't hesitate. "I'm in." She wasn't sure what Jake knew, but she trusted him. And whatever it was, it might be exactly what she needed. Rick had built his little kingdom on other people's backs, treating them like they were replaceable. But this time, he messed with the wrong person. Amy sat on her couch, gripping her phone as she waited for Jake to explain. The air in her apartment felt heavier, charged with something she couldn't quite name. She had always known Rick wasn't the cleanest businessman. But if Jake had something solid, something real, then this was bigger than just getting back at a bad boss. "I don't want to do this over the phone," Jake finally said. "Meet me tomorrow. Coffee shop on 7th around noon." Amy didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rick's smug face, the way he spat out his anger, like she was nothing. She kept replaying that moment, the unfairness of it all, the way she had walked out with her head high, even though she was shaking inside. By the time the sun rose, she was more determined than ever. The next day, she arrived at the coffee shop early, grabbing a seat near the window. Jake showed up right on time, a serious expression on his face as he slid into the seat across from her. He looked tired, like he had spent the night thinking too. "I did some digging," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Well, more like I already knew this, but I went back to double-check." Amy leaned in. "What is it?" Jake lowered his voice. "Rick's been cooking the books." Amy blinked. "Like fraud?" Jake nodded. "Big time. I started noticing it when I was working there. Orders that didn't match inventory, numbers that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was just bad bookkeeping, but then I realized it's on purpose. He's hiding money, Amy." Amy's mind raced. "How do you know for sure?" "Because I saw the invoices," Jake said. "Back when I was still working in the kitchen, I helped take inventory. Some weeks, we'd get a shipment of food that was way bigger than what we actually needed. But the thing is, half of it never made it into the stockroom. It just disappeared. Then I started checking the paperwork. The numbers didn't match what was actually being sold." Amy frowned. "So where's the extra food going?" Jake exhaled. "I'm pretty sure he's running some kind of side business. Either reselling supplies under the table or pocketing money through fake orders. And since he pays most of his employees in cash under the table to avoid taxes, there's no real record of how much he's actually making. Amy shook her head, disbelief mixing with anger. And no one's caught him. He's careful, Jake said. Plus, let's be real, who's gonna check? It's a small diner in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place nobody thinks twice about. Amy clenched her jaw. But we could expose him. Jake hesitated. We'd need proof. Real proof. The kind that would actually hold up if someone decided to investigate. Amy thought about all the years she had spent working for Rick. All the time she had seen strange things but ignored them because it wasn't her business. But now it was her business. He had taken away her job, her dignity, and he had done it without a second thought. If he thought she was just going to walk away, he was dead wrong. "What if I could get into his office?" she said slowly. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You really think he'd keep that kind of stuff lying around?" Amy smirked. "Rick's a control freak. He doesn't trust computers, doesn't trust anyone but himself. If he's keeping track of anything, I guarantee it's in that office." Jake considered this. "You sure you want to go down this road?" Amy met his eyes. "I don't have a choice." She didn't just want revenge. She wanted justice. Amy's heart pounded as she walked past the diner that evening, its neon sign flickering in the fading light. It felt strange seeing it from the outside, knowing she no longer belonged there. Through the window, she spotted Rick at his usual spot near the register, barking orders at a waitress who looked just as exhausted as Amy had felt every night after closing. She took a slow breath. Tonight had to be perfect. Jake had been right. If they were going to take Rick down, they needed proof. And Amy knew exactly where to find it. Rick's office was in the back of the diner, past the kitchen, behind a door he always kept locked. She had only been inside a handful of times, usually when he was lecturing her about cutting costs or making her count the register. She remembered the old metal filing cabinet in the corner, stuffed with invoices and receipts. If there was evidence of his scheme, it would be in there. The plan was simple. Wait until closing, slip inside, grab what she needed, and get out. But nothing about it felt simple. Amy checked her phone. Jake was parked down the street, waiting in case something went wrong. She texted him a quick asterisk, "I'm going in asterisk," before slipping around the side of the building. The back entrance was used for deliveries, and Amy knew the lock was tricky. She had fumbled with it enough times on early morning shifts to know that with the right touch, it would open. She reached for the handle, testing it. Locked. She dug into her bag, pulling out a small metal tool Jake had given her, a tension wrench he had called it. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced. She slid the tool into the lock, wiggling it the way Jake had shown her. For a second, nothing happened. Then asterisk click asterisk. She exhaled and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The kitchen was dark, the only sound a faint hum from the refrigerator. She moved quickly, stepping carefully to avoid the creaky tiles near the sink. The office was just ahead. She reached the door and tried the knob. Locked. Of course. Amy gritted her teeth. She hadn't expected this to be easy. She glanced around and spotted the key rack on the wall. Rick always kept a spare. Her fingers traced the keys until she found the one she needed. Sliding it into the lock, she turned it slowly. The door swung open with a quiet creak. The office was exactly as she remembered, messy, cluttered, papers stacked haphazardly on the desk. She wasted no time, heading straight for the filing cabinet. The first drawer was filled with old receipts, nothing unusual. The second had employee records, half of them handwritten, probably because Rick didn't want a paper trail leading to his under-the-table deals. But it was the third drawer that made her breath catch. Invoices, dozens of them. Some marked with numbers that didn't add up, others listing shipments that never arrived at the diner. Amy snapped photos as fast as she could. This was it, the proof they needed. Then from the front of the diner, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Someone was still here. Amy froze, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving closer. Someone was still here. She had been so sure everyone had left, but now panic clawed at her chest. If Rick caught her in his office, she wouldn't just be fired. She'd be in serious trouble. She shoved the last stack of papers back into the drawer, careful not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped just outside the office. She could hear breathing. Heavy, impatient. Amy's mind raced. There was no way out except the door, and whoever was on the other side was blocking it. She pressed herself against the desk, heart hammering. Then the door handle rattled. "Who's in there?" A voice snapped. Amy recognized it immediately. It wasn't Rick. It was Mark, the diner's night cook. She almost sighed in relief, but then she realized Mark was Rick's right-hand man. If he found her, he'd tell Rick in a second. She had one shot. Amy glanced at the window across the office. Too small to climb through, but if she could distract him. Mark jiggled the handle harder. "Rick, you in there." Amy acted fast. She grabbed a cup from the desk and threw it against the far wall, making it crash to the floor. At the same time, she ducked behind a stack of boxes, pressing herself as low as she could. The door burst open. Mark stormed in, his flashlight sweeping across the room. He saw the broken cup and cursed under his breath. Amy stayed completely still, barely breathing. Mark grumbled, stepping further inside. That was her chance. She slipped out, moving fast but quiet, her pulse pounding in her ears. The second she was in the hallway, she bolted toward the back door. But before she could reach it, a voice boomed behind her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Amy skidded to a stop, her stomach dropping. He was standing near the register, arms crossed, his face dark with suspicion. Amy turned slowly, and that's when she saw it. Rick, handcuffed and being led outside, was smiling. A cold, knowing smile. And in that instant, she realized this wasn't over. Amy stood frozen, watching Rick's eerie smile as the officers guided him toward their patrol car. A chill ran through her. He had just been caught red-handed. His entire operation was crumbling. And yet, he didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who still had something up his sleeve. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, snapping her back to reality. "You okay?" She nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. She glanced at Rick one last time before turning to Jake. "How did you get them here so fast?" Jake hesitated. "I made a call while you were inside. I told them about the fraud, the fake invoices, and that Rick might be involved in something bigger. Turns out he was already on their radar." Amy frowned. "What do you mean?" Jake sighed. "This isn't just about the diner. Rick's been under investigation for months. Money laundering, illegal deals, connections to people who don't play by the rules. Your photos gave them the last piece they needed." Amy's breath caught. She had thought she was exposing a crooked boss. She hadn't realized she was walking straight into something much bigger. As Rick was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car, he turned his head just slightly, just enough for Amy to catch the last thing he said before they drove off. "This isn't over." A shiver crawled down her spine, but she pushed it aside. He was just trying to get in her head. He had lost. That was all that mattered. In the days that followed, the story exploded. News stations picked up on the arrest, and suddenly Everyone was talking about the corrupt diner owner who had been running scams under the table. Employees started coming forward, sharing their own experiences of being underpaid and mistreated. It was bigger than she had ever imagined. Amy watched it all unfold from a distance, trying to process everything. She had spent years working at that place, thinking she was just another waitress in a nowhere town. But she had stood up for what was right, and now Rick was facing the consequences. One afternoon, as she sat at a cafe scrolling through updates on her phone, Jake slid into the seat across from her. "You okay?" he asked. She exhaled. "I think so. It's just a lot." Jake nodded. "Yeah, but you did the right thing." Amy gave a small smile. So did you. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She wasn't just the girl who got fired for doing the right thing. She was the girl who fought back. She had lost her job, but she had gained something far more important: a voice. And she wasn't afraid to use it anymore. As she and Jake walked out of the cafe, she let the warm sunlight wash over her. The future was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, she was ready. Amy skidded to a stop, her stomach dropping. He was standing near the register, arms crossed, his face dark with suspicion. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then Rick's eyes flickered toward the office. His expression shifted from confusion to something colder. Amy gripped her phone in her pocket, her fingers still on the camera app. She had what she needed, but getting out with it was another problem. Rick took a step closer. "You're real stupid, you know that." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Amy forced herself to stand tall. "I just came to get my last paycheck," she lied, keeping her voice steady. Rick chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Try again." Behind him, Mark was stepping out of the office, looking between them with suspicion. "She was in there," he said. "Didn't see what she was doing, but—" Rick held up a hand to silence him, his gaze never leaving Amy. "You think you can take something from me?" Rick said, voice low. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Amy clenched her fists. She had expected anger, but there was something else in his tone. Something more dangerous. And that's when she realized Rick wasn't just running a scam. He was hiding something much worse. Something he was willing to do anything to protect. Amy's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to think fast. Rick was blocking the front, Mark was behind her, and she had just stolen evidence that could ruin him. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew she wouldn't make it to the door before Rick stopped her. Rick took another step forward, his expression darkening. "You want to explain what you were doing in my office." Amy kept her face blank. "Like I said, I came for my paycheck." Rick let out a sharp laugh. "You think I'm stupid?" Amy's mind raced. She could deny everything, but Rick didn't seem like the kind of man who needed proof to take action. He was already convinced she had something on him, and that made her dangerous in his eyes. "I don't care what you think," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I just want to leave." Rick's eyes flickered toward her pocket, as if he already knew she had taken photos. His jaw tightened. "You didn't walk in here just to chat, Amy." His tone was quieter now, more controlled. "You've been asking the wrong questions, talking to the wrong people." "That's a problem." Amy swallowed hard. He wasn't just angry, he was nervous. And that meant she was right. There was more to this than just cooking the books. "You're stealing," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "And I can prove it." Mark shifted uncomfortably behind her, but Rick didn't flinch. Instead, a slow smirk crept across his face. "So what?" he said. "You think anyone cares? This is a small-town diner. Nobody's looking at me. Nobody's coming to shut me down. Amy held her ground. Maybe not. But if the right people see what I have, they'll care. Rick's smirk faded. His eyes darkened. And who exactly do you think you're gonna show? Amy's fingers tightened around her phone. She knew she had to get out, and fast. Doesn't matter, she said. What matters is I have proof. Rick stepped forward, closing the space between them. Give me the phone. Amy didn't move. No. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a loud asterisk bang asterisk from the back of the diner shattered the silence. Amy flinched, and Rick's head snapped toward the noise. In that split second, she moved. She spun around, shoving past Mark before he could react, sprinting toward the back door. She grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. A sick feeling twisted in her stomach. Locked. Rick was already moving. You're not leaving. Amy whirled around just as headlights flashed through the diner's front window. A car screeched to a stop outside. Jake. Amy barely had time to register what was happening before a pounding knock rattled the front door. Police. Open up. Rick's face drained of color. Amy's chest tightened as everything clicked into place. She hadn't called the cops, but Jake had. Rick's eyes darted between her and the flashing lights outside. His nostrils flared, and for a second, she thought he might do something reckless. But then, just as quickly, his shoulders slumped. He knew it was over. Mark stepped back, looking just as shocked as Rick. You set me up, Rick muttered, glaring at Amy. She met his eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. No, she said. You set yourself up. The police burst through the door, and just like that, Rick's little empire crumbled. Amy exhaled, the tension finally releasing from her chest. She had won. But just as she turned toward Jake, ready to thank him, she noticed something in his expression, something that made her stomach drop. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her.